Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be ranking all of my Oden's eyeshadow palettes. Oden's is probably my favorite eyeshadow brand. I love their shadows, their color stories, their packaging. They are buildable, blendable, pigmented. Oden's is awesome. And it's actually pretty hard to sit and look at a pile of palettes from your favorite company and go, gee, which one do I like best? Which one do I like least? And how does everything fit in the middle? But that's what I'm going to do today. So if you'd like to see that, don't go anywhere. If you're new to my channel, hi, my name's Rachel. I'm a homeschooling stay-at-home mom. I love to play with colorful eyeshadow. I did film this look, which is a little more neutral than I usually go, but I will link it down below for you once it's live. And I upload about 3 videos a week, all eyeshadow related content. So if you would like to see lots of colorful content on your timeline, I do hope that you'll consider liking and subscribing. All right, let's get into it. I have 7 Oden's palettes, and it was kind of hard to decide how these fell in a ranking, but it's a fun project to do because you really see what palettes you love the most and which ones maybe you can let go of because they're not getting the use that you'd like them to get and somebody else might love them a lot more. So we're going to start at the very bottom with number 7, and I have chosen the Elva II Mini Ocean palette. This is such a beautiful palette. Honestly, all of these palettes are beautiful. All of them have lovely color stories and amazing performance. I'm not complaining about the performance of pretty much any of these palettes. They're all great. I recommend all of them. If you love the color story, if this is up your alley, certainly recommend it. It's great. This is the Elva II Mini Ocean palette. The reason that for me it's falling at the bottom is actually twofold. First off, I have discovered in my eyeshadow journey that I don't really use palettes that are smaller than about 9 pans. I usually use about 5 shadows for any given look, and so if a palette only offers me 6 or 7 shadows, hopefully it's a one and done sort of palette, but if it is, then I feel like that's the only kind of look I can get from that palette, and if it's not a one and done, then I have to reach into something else, and then there's a fly, go away. It's just a palette that's a little bit smaller for me is less inspiring because I only see a couple of options when I look at it. So this palette is ranked lowest because it is smaller. However, it is beautiful. It really is. I love these blues right here, and then the complement of orange to blue. This one's more brown. These two are shimmers. I think this is their shimmer formula as well. And then this blue is actually kind of weird. This formula exists in a couple of my Oden's palettes, my older ones, and that's another reason that this is ranked lowest, because I find that this formula, it's not a proper shimmer, but it's also not a proper matte. It's kind of somewhere in the middle, almost like a ColourPop satin formula, which is a matte with sparkle. However, this is a bit more of a creamy sort of base. I don't really know what Oden's calls this formula, but I don't particularly like it. I find it a little difficult to work with. You'll see this crop up in a couple of the other palettes that are ranked lower because it doesn't perform like either a shimmer or a matte. And it's a little bit harder to manipulate. You put it where you want it to be and then it just sticks there. It doesn't even blend out on the edges very well. I don't know. That's the reason this palette is ranked lower. These two shimmers are very, very pretty and they pair so beautifully with this light blue. But because it's smaller and because it has this formula, which I don't really care for, it's just not the most exciting Oden's palette for me. So that's why it's number 7. At number 6, I have the Elva II Mini Forest palette. Same reason as far as the size of the palette, although I like this color story a little bit more. I think that this is a bit more unexpected and charming. I do really like this pop of blue and the yellow here, and then we could deepen this with a shimmery blue here, but it's not too dark, which personal preference, I like light to mid-tone shimmers. And then this brown is a matte, so you could use this to deepen out the blue, or you could use that as a foundation for any of these 3 colors as well. I think that this is very aptly named the Mini Forest because it does remind me of these more neutral, grounded kinds of tones. Although, for me, I think I've said in a different video, it's not really the depths of the forest like perhaps the Wilderness palette from Beauty Bay. This is more like the grassy meadow on the outskirts of the forest. I could see buttercups growing and a little brook babbling nearby because these are much lighter toned neutral colors. They're not deep and dark. So I think that this is a much more appealing color story for me, and you can really go 2 different directions. With the other one, you could go blue or you could go orange, but this one you can do the blue, you can do the brown, but you could also go with the yellow, like the blue and the yellow, or the brown and the yellow. You could do green and yellow, and then this shimmer here is more of a soft pinky apricot, and it also would work nicely with this brown or with the yellow, or you could even throw it with this Tiffany color just for good measure. I think it's a more interesting color story. I feel a little bit more inspired when I look at this palette, so that's why it's ranking a bit higher. Next, we have the first palette that I ever bought from Oden's. This is the Nords palette. It does pain me a bit to put this one so low at number 5, but honestly, this palette doesn't get that much use within my collection. At this point, I know myself a bit better, my eyeshadow and color preferences, my application preferences, and when I bought this palette, I wasn't as familiar with myself at that point. So I love this. I mean, I love the outer packaging. It's so beautiful. Uden's Eye just kills it with their packaging. And I do really like the inner color story as well. This is a much deeper palette. This entire row right here, all multi-chromes, and they're beautiful. I love them. This right here is like mermaid personified, and it's so pretty. I love this lovely purple matte, purple shimmer, a silvery matte right here. This color here, Pink Chameleon, is a multi-chrome as well, and you could also use it as a face highlighter. And then this green here, I don't remember the last time I used it, but it is a very pretty mossy green shimmer. It's really nice. This teal shade right here, gorgeous. My qualms with this palette are again with the formula, as in that blue palette. This shadow right here, this red, I wish that this were either a matte or a shimmer, but it's not. It's sort of stuck in the middle. It's not sure what it wants to be, and it performs very, very difficult. I did a palette bingo with my friend on Instagram using this palette, and this red shade was one that we pulled one of the random numbers generated, and both of us struggled with it. So I know it's not just my palette. It's not like mine went hard pan or anything. She had the same problem. It's just a hard shade to work with. It doesn't blend very well. It builds okay, but it's kind of a weird formula. I don't know. It's like it just sort of sticks. Doesn't move around, doesn't blend at the edges. You can't add another shadow on top to try to blend it out. It just, not the easiest formula to work with. And I think that really turns me off of this palette in general, because this shade is lovely, but because I don't use it, it's like, oh, okay. And then this brown is a similar story. It doesn't really get used. So this palette certainly doesn't get used as much as I wish it did. Some of the color stories are exciting to me, but the whole thing is a little bit too dark now for my eyeshadow preferences. At this point, I really only use the dark colors in the very outer corner. I prefer the contrast of light to dark. I prefer light and medium mattes and shimmers across the board, with just a deepening matte in the outer corner. And this palette is certainly more of a deep dark toned palette. There are a couple of standout shades, like this whole bottom row, and then this one right here are lovely. These two are pretty, but they're not like out of this world remarkable, nothing really to write home about. And this one's nice too. So I'd say maybe 30% of the palette doesn't excite me, and I feel like it should. So I have considered selling these bottom 3 palettes. I might do that at some point, because I don't want to hold on to things that aren't getting used. And I know that other people have other preferences, so this might be completely loved by someone else. And I'd rather pass it on before it expires, before it gets too old, before it hard pans. Like, pass it on to someone who's going to love it and use it more than I do. So I've considered that. We'll see. But for right now, this is in number 5. Okay, number 4 is the Saga of Freya Cat's Breath palette. This was a collection. There was the Saga of Freya palette, which was two-sided. It was a book, so you opened into a palette and then you flipped over. There was a palette on the other side. And then there were 2 smaller palettes within that collection, the Cat's Breath and the Amber Tears. Amber Tears was a lot more pinky, rosy sorts of tones, and the larger palette was kind of a conglomeration of the two, sort of, but my preference out of the 3 was the Cat's Breath palette. I love this Tiffany and orange color story. I think it's unique. I think it's really pretty. This blue right here, I think I use it every time I play with this palette. I always grab this blue. It's a beautiful transition. It's interesting. It's pigmented. It deepens out lovely when you use this one right here. Or you could go a little bit less dark and teal and use this brown. I love this orange. For the longest time, this was the best orange in my collection. I now have the orange sorbet palette from BH Cosmetics Sweet Shop series, and that whole palette is just awesome. But this is still a beautiful, true, bright orange. I love it. And then this orange goes very nicely with the white peach shade right here, which is more of a muted, soft, peachy kind of orange. It's beautiful. And then we've got 4 shimmers, which are so unique. Here we've got a blue-white shimmer. This is more of a silvery teal. Up here, it's kind of a multicolored fleck, sort of. There's purple, blue, peachy, orangey, silver kind of tones all throughout this shade here. And then this one right here is definitely an orangey peach with pink flecks. They're all beautiful. It's unique, it's interesting, and it's a lot of fun to create different looks using this palette. I actually really like this palette. It's not my most favorite, it's not my most inspiring, but overall I think it's lovely and creative, and I do really like it. Okay, now we're in the top 3. I'm going to give number 3 to the Hummingbird palette between Uden's Eye and Tina from the Fancy Face. The first time I saw their original 3 Legendary Diversa palettes, that was this one, the Giant Wolves palette with Annette from Annette's Makeup Corner, and the Red Dragon palette with Judy, who was the first YouTuber that I found when I first started doing eyeshadow. I was immediately drawn to this one. They were all beautiful. If I could grab a second one, I would have gone for Giant Wolves for all those beautiful deep pigmented shades. But this is the one that caught my eye because I was finally discovering colorful eyeshadow, and I mean, so stunning. Tina is a Jamaican woman, and she was so inspired by the vibrancy and pigmentation of the colors in Jamaica, as well as hummingbirds. They have a special significance for her. So this palette was a merging of those two ideas, the bright colors of Jamaica and the bright colors of hummingbirds put together in gorgeousness. So beautiful. This palette only has a couple of mattes, 1, 2, 3, 4 mattes, and the rest are shimmers. So I can do an entire look out of this guy, but I'm pretty limited on my color choices. I personally prefer a palette that's more matte heavy with some really standout shimmers. This is more shimmer heavy with some mattes, and the mattes do work nicely with the shimmers that are presented within the palette. There's nothing that doesn't fit in, but because it's super shimmer heavy, I often will reach into this palette for a shimmer after having done a matte look with a different palette. But it's so beautiful. It's great quality. All of these are great quality. Oden's Eye is awesome. And I love the assortment of shimmers. I love that there's nothing too close. You know, sometimes you get a slightly bigger palette. I mean, this isn't bigger, but you can get a palette that has some shades that are just a little too close. It's like, well, why did you bother? Just put in something that's really different. All of these are really different. The only ones that would be close are these two purples, but this is a lilac-y sort of lavender purple with gold shift, and then this is a deep royal purple with blue. They're so beautiful. I love this green. This is the best lime green in my collection. I will card above for you a video where I did a St. Patrick's Day look, and I swatched all the lime green shimmers in my collection. I think I had 8 or 9 at that time. This was number 1. This was number 1. So good. And then this orange reminds me of that incredible orange shimmer within the Melt Amor de Mariposas palette. Just breathtaking shimmer. I think this palette is really beautiful, and this one right here actually makes me think of one of the shimmers within the Nords palette. So if I were to sell the Nords palette, I would still have a shadow similar to that color represented here in a palette that I'm much more likely to remember and reach for and use. So overall, it's beautiful. It's just such a remarkably colorful and lovely palette. I love it. It's great. The number 2 spot I am giving to the Hella palette between Oden's Eye and Angelic Nyqvist. I think that this palette is so beautiful. Look at that reveal. We got grayscale with green tint, and then bam, colors. I think this palette is lovely. Angelica is my favorite YouTuber. Does anybody not know that at this point? I say it in like every video. She's great. She's awesome. She really knew what she was doing when she created this palette because it has everything. Light, medium, dark mattes, light, medium, dark shimmers, deepening shades, lightening shades, inner corner highlights. This one right here can be used as a face highlighter. It's awesome. I love the color story. The only reason that I'm ranking this one a little bit lower than number 1 is because 2 to 3 shades, particularly this one right here, are kind of not that great on my skin. Now, this is the palette that I used for today's eye look, along with my Mel Amor de Mariposas palette. But for today's eye look, I used this, and this. And then I also grabbed 2 shimmers from the Melt palette, but I used this one pretty heavily in today's eye look because I wanted to do like a green, brown, gold sort of thing. So I just grabbed the gold shimmers elsewhere, but everything else was taken from the Hella palette. It's beautiful. I love the yellow, green, pink color story. I love how we have this vibrant pink here that's just gonna stand out. The same with this green right here. This shade here, Fluorescence, is what I have on my inner corners right here on the lower lash line. It's just a really beautiful palette. But for me, it's ranked a little bit lower because this shade here, not that great on me. Angie has different undertones. She has more yellow gold undertones to her skin. I have blue undertones. So the colors that look amazing on her don't always look as great on me. This one in particular. I don't think I'm ever gonna use this shade. I used it once and I was like, just on my skin tone, but the rest I can definitely pull off, and it's a wonderful, well curated, beautifully performing, interesting, unique, and diverse palette. You can get so many looks from this palette. Colorful, grungy, neutral, matte, shimmer, light, dark. It's crazy versatile, and it's just beautiful. So mad props to Angie for doing an awesome job. And finally, number 1 in my Oden's Eye ranking as of today is the Solmona 2 eyeshadow palette. I think that this guy is everything that an eyeshadow palette wants to be. For me and my preferences and my colors, it's perfection. First off, look at the packaging. Can we just appreciate the Oden's Eye artists are awesome. They deserve a raise. But then the inside of the palette, when I saw this one sneak peeked, I knew it had a lot of potential, and I was just like, I need to keep my eye on that. And then when it was finally revealed, it was one of the few palettes that I bought new. I also bought Hella because that was limited edition. It was going to go away. But it's one of the few palettes that I've bought new on launch. I just fell in love with it because if I could create a palette, it would pretty much be this. Blue, purple, aqua, yellow, orange, deep shades, light shades, mid-tone shades, light to mid-tone shimmers in particular, a couple of shades to deepen out anything you want to do. We've got a deep blue matte, a deep purple matte, and a deep brownish matte. And you can use them for any of the other shadows within the palette. It's going to be great. It is so perfect. Nothing is duplicate. Everything works with everything else. You can use these funky warm tones with the cool tones and get an interesting look. You can go all cool, all warm. I guess the one thing you couldn't do is neutral. There aren't any neutral tones in here, which is fine because I almost never do neutral. And if I want to do something neutral, I can grab the Hella palette. I can grab Limoncello from Colourpop. I have a few palettes in my collection that are less rainbow, vibrant, hummingbird, parrot kinds of colors, but overall I definitely tend towards colorful eyeshadow, so I don't have that many palettes that are neutral, and it's okay with me. This is all colors. All of these shades work well on me, which is why it's at number 1 instead of number 2, because within the Hella palette, although I adore that color scheme, there are 2 to 3 shades that just aren't that great on my skin tone, but in this palette, everything works. It's all great. It's just a smash hit. This is a beautiful palette. I believe it is permanent to their line. If you like this color story, I cannot recommend more highly that you get this palette because it is spectacular. So there you go. That is my ranking of my Oden's Eye palettes. So much fun to go through my collection, see what I have, see what I'm using, see what I like the best. And it's also exciting because sometimes if you have a larger collection, I don't have a huge collection. I have about 30 palettes, I think. I mean, it's not tiny, but it's not, I don't have hundreds of them. But even with my smaller collection, it still can be a challenge to remember what I have, and doing this sort of video is a great way to be like, okay, let me grab all the palettes from this brand, and you start to get excited about palettes again. Like when I do this for BH Cosmetics, I rediscover the Passion in Paris palette and the Blueberry Muffin palettes, which were favorites, and I go, oh, that's right, ooh, I should play with them again, and it's exciting and it's fun. It's also really helpful for me personally because if I see a palette that I'd forgotten about entirely and never really excited me that much, I know that it's time to let that one go. Like I can pass it along. I don't feel bad. It's not cluttering up my drawer and adding additional stuff in my life that's not being used. I would rather pass it on to someone who will use it. So these kinds of videos are super helpful for me for that as well, because the things at the bottom, if I'm just not using them and I don't like them for any reason, I usually end up passing them on. So thank you for hanging out with me, for clicking on my video. I hope you liked it. Please comment below what your favorite Oden's Eye palettes are. If you have any of these, what you think of them. If you have been inspired by seeing something on my channel and maybe you want to go grab it yourself or grab that palette from your collection and dip back into it, have a little bit of fun. I would love to hear all of that. I love interacting with my viewers in the comments. I hope that you will consider liking and subscribing, and until I see you in my next video, hope you have a great day. Bye!